a little bit orange. Gonna hit the button.
All right, do it.
And we're live. It is Thursday, October 21st, 2021, 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time. And we like the color orange. It is perfectly seasonal today. It matches the irises on Ben's dog shirt. It matches my copy of Ulysses behind me. But there is no orange on the cover of Will Codrington's new book that he is here to discuss today.
Hold up the book.
What?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, you have to hold the book.
What's the title of the book, Will?
The title of the book is The People's Constitution, 200 Years, 27 Amendments, and the Promise of a More Perfect Union.
Ooh.
We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have a copy of The People's Constitution if you buy it, which you can.
And I just put a link in the chat. This is with John Cowell at the Brennan Center, who you used to work with before you became a law professor. I have heard so many complaints about the process of writing this book, but I actually don't know how it all started and like how I didn't also mean that like a really bad thing. I wasn't trying to start with something negative. I just mean everyone complains about writing a book. Yes. And as your friend, I have heard a lot of those. And you do this really annoying thing where you turn off your phone on writing days and you don't respond to my fucking text messages. And so it's very frustrating.
That's the highest crime and misdemeanor in Kate's.
Yeah. And so I'm like,
in Kate's.
Yeah, it is.
There's something happening in an election world. I need your advice. But generally speaking, I don't actually know how you and John came about writing this book together, besides that you're both at the Brennan Center at like the beginning. So do you want to kind of tell us about it?
Yeah, so the book started, I guess, 4 years ago. The idea came in the aftermath of the 2016 election and, the Electoral College having given us the wrong winner, and a particularly bad wrong winner, was sort of simulating this question, which is, why don't we get rid of the Electoral College? And you do a little bit more research, you find out that the Electoral College is one of the top two subjects for a constitutional amendment throughout our history. And so there's been many attempts. You had a very close attempt, the Equal Rights Amendment. Come on, Kate, didn't you write your college thesis or a paper on this?
I knew the answer to that. Yes.
Top two by what measure?
In terms of the number of resolutions actually introduced.
I see.
So sheer number.
In Congress, in Congress or in
Congress.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep. And like we're talking about near 1,000 for each of these, right? Like many people introduce resolutions for these in yearly, and so there's been these attempts. And for the Electoral College, there actually was a very, very close attempt in the 1960s and 70s where we got close to getting a national popular vote, but that was thwarted by Southern segregationists and a filibuster anchored by Strom Thurmond. But the idea was, not only do we have this problem with the Electoral College, but there are other problems with the Constitution that we know and recognize today. And so what did other people do? What did other previous generations do to actually get this done? And what were the sort of conditions that allowed to amend the Constitution? Because we have 27 amendments, right? And we have 27 amendments. When you take it all into account, it's about, 40% of the overall Constitution's length. So nearly rivaling the original Constitution.
But hang on a second. 12 of those amendments happen within a very short time of the 12th Amendment is in 1801, right?
1804.
1804, sorry. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the Bill of Rights.
Hate people like you guys that can just remember shit like that. Anyway, go ahead.
So the Bill of Rights happens within, in the first Congress, and is kind of part of the ratification process, really. And then the two subsequent amendments happen really fast.
Sure. And so that's actually but that's important. That's to say that, I mean, first, that's important for a number of reasons. One, it showed that the amendment process works, right? So we can think about it as in the founding era, and that's actually the name of the chapter for the first 12 amendments is the founding era amendments. But it critically showed that amending the Constitution was possible, which was something that the anti-federalists said wasn't possible. But also, it shows that it did something that later amendments actually built on, was to insert important protections that bolster democracy and protect individual rights into the Constitution. So it set a very, very important precedent that period. And then obviously we talked about the 11th and the 12th Amendment too. Those were also within the same sort of 15-year period early on. And those did important things themselves. But it is just that fact that we got those first 10 amendments is super important. Another part of that fact that is really important and a theme of the book is that we actually amend in clusters. We don't amend in this staccato manner, right? So we get this bunch of 10 amendments and then 2 amendments shortly afterwards. And then we kind of have these dry spells, and then we get another cluster. And then we have these dry spells of periods of decades, and then we get another cluster, and that cycle repeats. So those are actually important things that raise up themes of the book.
Okay,
that's interesting. Oh,
okay,
sorry, go ahead. No, please.
Okay, I have a ton of questions. I'm just gonna briefly list them. Bruce Ackerman's constitutional moments theory. I want to hear kind of. I would love it if you could just briefly explain it to the audience, and then kind of engage with how what you and John propose here is kind of different or builds on that, and kind of addresses the idea of kind of the periodic evolution of the Constitution, as you said, the clusters of amendments. 2, I'm really curious about whether or not those political clusters come about because of what the cause and effect is. Do they come about because there is significant enough kind of collective action that you can have politically, just in politics in general, as to say, a just bipartisan kind of grouping, or not even bipartisan, majoritarian party politics at moments in time? Does that map over onto it? You can just get shit done, amendments in certain periods of time, and you can't in others? Or whether it's because of great moments of social change and agitation and a need for procedural strong guards. I mean, I am cynical, so I would say it's probably the former. I would guess it's actually the genesis of it is more political, is because of there's a political moment for it, not that there is a social or cultural demand for it just at that time. But anyways, either of those or both of them.
I'll start with both. So Bruce Ackerman's theory of these constitutional moments, that came from his We the People trilogy. And the idea there is that, we get these periods that you get this alignment in popular politics and usually sort of started by a big wave election, maybe something else, but you have this realignment. And you have these moments, these sort of compressed periods where you get robust constitutional change. Now, his thought is, and others think about this too, if you think about how we amend the Constitution, John and I are focusing mostly on formal amendments, formal change. Bruce Ackerman doesn't limit his sort of theory to that. So, for example, a big period he talks about, and we talk about it too, but in a different context, is the sort of Roosevelt Revolution and the New Deal Revolution, that being a significant alignment, realignment, and sort of expansion of federal power. And that was also ratified by the successive wave elections that gave us FDR and 4 consecutive wins, right? So he's got this idea, and I don't think ours sort of contests that as much as to say that we're not thinking about the informal parts as much, and we also think about 4 periods. I think Bruce Ackerman really only acknowledges 2
Yeah, it's
periods of
really annoying,
constitutional
actually.
moments. I think he says
So-
like the Reconstruction period and then the
Yes.
New Deal period and nothing else. But he
Yeah,
talks about
and
these
I'm
other
like-
ones, like the Civil Rights period, as being like this failed constitutional moment, or like maybe Reagan being this failed constitutional moment. But he doesn't sort of give credence to these other periods that we focus on, that we've gotten actual formal constitutional change.
He never. I was a total asshole when I got to Yale and read We the People for the first time, and then was like, wait, there's nothing in here about the ERA. How could you even
Nothing.
like have? There's nothing in here. Like, he doesn't even count it. It's like the closest we've come in 50 years to having a constitutional amendment, and more than that, like 100 years. And he's like, just ignores it. I just like wrote him an email. I'm like, why do you just ignore this? And he never responded.
Yeah. So like what might put that in context for us is that, so I said we amend the Constitution in waves, right? These clusters. And Ben asked the first question, which was like, what was going on with the first one? Well, that was the early American history cluster, mostly Bill of Rights. Then we had the Reconstruction cluster. Then we had the Progressive era cluster, and then we had the Civil Rights Cold War era cluster. And just to put where the ERA fits in context, in the beginning or the end of each of these clusters, you get a failed constitutional amendment or two. And so the ERA was the first one that failed after the Civil Rights period. And then the second one was a very robust DC amendment that, for all intents and purposes, would have treated DC as a state. And so those were actually bigger amendment ideas than the amendments we actually got in the Civil War and the Civil Rights era, right? Because what we got was the elimination of the poll tax. Well, that's great, but that only was going on in 5 states in the South at the time. So most states had already gotten rid of it. It's just like one mechanism that they were using to suppress democracy. We got a sort of incomplete DC amendment, right? So I told you that the one that failed was the more complete one. We got one that just added DC to the Electoral College. And we also got, the lowering of the voting age for 18 years old. And that's like relatively big, but like also just not like huge, right? It's an anti-discrimination one, not an affirmative right to vote. The big one that was sort of a government operation one was the 25th Amendment, which was the succession of the presidency and the vice presidency. That came, of course, in light of Cold War fears that we needed an alert president at the button. JFK died, right? So we were in this period where like that was just something that we knew we didn't have clarity at the time, and we had enough experience to show that we needed to fix it. But the DC amendment, the ERA, were really robust. But at the time we got to those in the 1970s, there had been this conservative backlash or this rise of the new right, and the energy from these rights revolutions, the civil rights, the women's rights movements, the gay rights movement, that sort of had been sapped at the time. And that's the important thing. Whereas Bruce Ackerman says we had these constitutional moments, we sort of agree with that. But those moments are very short. You have a very short window where you have enough energy and sort of alignment to actually, in the conditions to actually amend the Constitution in the big way.
All right, but hang on a second. There is, in roughly the same period as these failed amendments that you described, a little bit earlier, an amendment that came, I think, within 1 or 2 states of being ratified, which is the Bricker Amendment, which is a kind of right-wing opposition to the citation of international law or the UN Charter in. I'm curious. I forget how close the Bricker Amendment came. I think it was actually sent to the states and got a bunch of states ratifying it. 53, 54 or something. What are the conditions that lead to these flurries of amendments that you're describing? And what are, because you look at the 18th and 19th century and you're like, there's the founding and there's a civil war. And, I don't look and say, gosh, well, let's have a civil war so we can have some, some more constitutional amendments. So we got to be looking to the 20th century for something sort of a little bit more encouraging than that. What are the conditions that you look at and say, okay, we're ripe to have a wave of constitutional amendments here?
Yeah, so importantly, the Bricker Amendment didn't make it out of Congress, but it was close. And I just want to highlight that because
it didn't make it out of Congress, which means that it didn't even go to the states. I thought you
but there
was a few states away. Do you mean like state senator? You mean like?
I guess it was a few votes
away. Right, exactly.
Okay. Sorry, okay. I misremembered that.
No worries. There were 6 failed amendments that made it out of Congress and made it to the states, but did not actually get passed. And I can talk about those two because they're very interesting.
You count the ERA twice, or do you just count it once, Will?
Once.
Okay.
As the failed amendment. And so I'm happy to talk about those because those are also interesting and quirky stories. But just to get at Ben's question, which also built on the question that you asked earlier, Kate, was like, what are these conditions? And I don't think that we should exclude the ones that occurred in the 19th century because they also highlight things that have similarities to the ones that happened in the 20th century. So what we try to do at the end is like look at these things that were catalysts or conditions that existed, right? And so this is mostly a history book. So we're not going to say like, this means we will definitely do it. But a few things I'll highlight. So one thing is very unpopular Supreme Court decisions. And so I recently wrote a piece in the Atlantic about this. But there have been in every amending period a very unpopular Supreme Court decision. And as you know, the Supreme Court interprets a provision of the Constitution. The only way you're going to change that is either amend the Constitution or have the Supreme Court change its mind. It changes its mind seldomly. It did from like Plessy to Brown versus Board, but that's very seldom. And so in every period, there has been a very unpopular Supreme Court opinion. And so in the founding period.
This is the one that you said the framers would have wanted us to use the amendment process more.
That's correct.
Right.
And so, and I'll name one from each era. One, there was the decision first that we had to strip the Supreme Court of its jurisdiction in the 11th Amendment because they said that citizens can sue states, right? So that's the first time it happened. Not only did that undermine the Supreme Court decision, but it also sort of curtailed the actual judiciary and the structure. So that's it does two things, not just the reverse, but also to change the judicial structure. We did it with Dred Scott, and that was very much in the Reconstruction Amendments. We did it with Oregon versus Mitchell, which was in the Civil Rights era, which was the right for 18-year-olds to vote. And we also did it in terms of the income tax in the Progressive era. So that's a very common thing. And a couple of those, they actually opened the window to amending because people are so mad. Right. And I think my sense is that Citizens United is like that sort of equivalent. Right. This is something that universally, like on both sides of the spectrum, people point to a decision they hate. Citizens United may be that sort of thing. And in fact, there's sort of movement to try to do that. And there has been movement to do that. So that's one thing is very unpopular Supreme Court opinions. Another thing we see is a sense of insecurity. So Ben, you mentioned, the founding era and the Reconstruction era. Well, we had real senses of insecurity because we were in the founding era. We weren't sure that the Constitution was going to even last, right? At various points, the country almost tore itself apart, including the contested election of 1800. It had
just torn itself apart. It had literally just thrown out the Articles of Confederation. I mean, they're just
correct.
Sorry. Yeah.
Correct. And that's true. And so the Civil War, also a period of like immense insecurity. And we actually got to the point of tearing ourselves apart, right? And so we get immense senses of insecurity through war. We get it through depression, right? Economic downturn. We get it through pandemic, right? Pandemic was happening in the Progressive era. And that was the period when we were amending the Constitution to give women the right to vote. We get it in a lot of other people, the Cold War period. Right? Like that's a feeling of insecurity, national insecurity. And so in these periods, whether it's war or sort of recession or something else that kind of brings this massive national sense of insecurity, that can open a window because it tends to show that the Constitution's not doing something it should be doing, right? And that can be any of those things in those periods. So that's another. I can go on. There's other things. One thing that we see is like, we see some experimentation in the state. So this is something that I think is important for people who think that, like progressives are these people who want to ignore states. I think the states are super important because the states often do things that lead to amendments in the future, right? Like they inform what we do. And so, for example, abolition started in the states. The 13th Amendment came after states were abolishing slavery. Like the 17th Amendment came about because states were trying to get around the appointment system for senators, right? And they actually pushed that change. And so this is happening all the time. Right now, we see states trying to experiment with their own systems and constitutional systems. And if they're popular enough, then those might take hold and be sort of shored up in the national constitution through amendment. So and that shows the federal government and the states as sort of partners in this thing and not sort of always antagonistic. But I do want to say one last thing, I guess, and I'll sort of shut up for a little bit. Ben, you mentioned the Bricker Amendment. I think that's something important to highlight. If we look at all these amendments, the amendments have been, by and large, and I would say with the exception of one, all pretty progressive, or what we think of in terms of progressive.
Yes.
And the one exception is the 22nd Amendment, and I can tell you the story about that, but it really is what they said. They were trying to kick the dead lion while he was down, really trying to get to FDR in his death when Republicans made it their first item of action once they gained control after being in the political wilderness, right? But other than that, all these amendments are increasing rights, protecting democracy, or they're technical amendments that help our Constitution work. And so we also see, most recently, but in these other periods where conservatives did try to change the Constitution. They saw what was happening in the progressive playbooks, and they just, their ideas didn't take hold. But there are various ideas where they came close, including continuing calls for a new constitutional convention.
So the tagline of the book is kind of like ending up more democratic, like basically that this is like moving, that like using the constitutional amendment process more is part of the reason that like, what I guess I'm kind of curious about is like how you're defining democratic. And one of the things that I'm kind of hearing as you're talking is the idea that you'd have like, is it because states are being used as experimentation, like crucibles? Is it because that there is like an engagement and it requires both political alignment and like a majoritarian-esque type of like kind of sensibility? Is it because it kind of like, so like is that collectively how you guys decide to define like more democratic? Because I actually think that that's like an interesting question, since there's just like so many, when you use it as an adjective, I think democratic turns into democratization turns into basically a much harder thing to quantify. And it can mean both like an early Madison type of democracy that is very majoritarian based, and a later Madisonian democracy, or lots of different types of democracies in between.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just kind of curious what you guys were imagining.
Yeah, so democracy, I want to just mean like in the small d sense, in the most basic sense, we have examples of just expanding democracy. So for example, we add the 15th Amendment, which grants the right to vote for Black men. So just expanding democracy by including more people in it who are not a part of the American people, not a part of the we the people. We have an amendment that restructures the Senate, so we elect them directly as opposed to having state legislators to choose them. We have an amendment that includes women. We have an amendment that lowers the voting age to 18. We have an amendment that gets rid of a vote obstruction tactic, which is the poll tax. And all of this just really what it does is it opens democracy to more people, and it changes the complexion of we the people in the United States. So just like in a very simple sense. But I also just want to say, like, something you and both of you sort of mentioned this too, it takes a lot to amend the Constitution. And I'm just like, I haven't drinking the Kool-Aid so much to think that like, oh, this is inevitable. But it does take this sort of realignment. And we've seen the realignment in terms of power plays, right? So this was just like the radical Republicans. You had most of the Democrats, so the Southern Democrats out, which made it easier to pass Reconstruction amendments where you're just not like, it was basically a term of war that they had to ratify some of these amendments, right?
Yeah,
and that
terms of readmission to the Union included ratification.
Correct.
We could get all kinds of
shit
constitutional amendments done if we could hold a gun to Mississippi's head.
Yeah, I mean, well, the problem was who was holding a gun to whose head first, and like that became a term. But we can talk about that.
I'm not saying it's not justified. I'm just saying the conditions are hard to replicate.
Right. So we don't want to replicate that one. That is one. And Ben, you said this up front. We don't want another Civil War. We don't want to replicate that one.
Why are we not talking about prohibition? Sorry, we're gonna go.
Oh, I want to get there. Oh, I don't have my drink.
I'm
drinking like water and cucumber water, right? Like I feel like I'm in prohibition right now. I should be drinking whiskey.
Why? Why are you doing this? Are you pregnant?
I don't know. Wow. But awesome. So,
Sorry. We've been friends for a very long time.
We have been. But you also get these sort of coalitions that make them possible too, right? And so the civil rights era is a perfect example of coalitions. You had to, again, exclude the Southern Democrats for the most part, but you had Northern Republicans and Democrats throughout other parts of the country that helped make that possible. Because like these were common sense, long overdue ideas to get these things done. We were having a racial reckoning that was building on the foundation of the original sort of Reconstruction amendments that were not given their deference. They basically were inutile for 9 centuries, right, during the Jim Crow era. And so you get these, you either get a wave election, and Bruce Ackerman talked about these wave elections, so that could be part of it. You get hardball politics where you just exclude the other party, or you get coalitions that make them possible. But basically, they are things that the country is behind enough, obviously, because you get a supermajority support to kind of get them out. And the trick is, once you get them out of Congress, for the most part, these things are going to pass, right? That's what the history shows. 27 amendments have passed, 6 have failed. One of them came very close. And so, I think that scares some people. Because the idea is, if we open the door to amending, like what kind of crazy do you get out of that, right? And I see that. But I think it's hard to open the door to amending until you have that sort of big backing from the majority. So, yeah.
A totally random question that I just actually can't.
Prohibition?
Yeah, well, no, it's not random. I just mentioned it. Well, try to keep up. There's there's a sorry, this is how
I'm so used to this. We've got Will's pregnancy on the table. We've got he can't keep up. I think we need to be more polite to our guests than this.
Oh my gosh.
I'm turning red because I'm embarrassed that I'm getting called out for teasing Will. But no, there's a
at least it's not orange.
Yes, it's true. At least. But there would be something very wrong if I was turning orange. But there was
we've got ongoing critique of the guest's wallpaper. There's a civility issue that this is all raising, KK.
I know. Okay, but I do want to talk. So one of the things that I never really got around to talking in my ERA paper, but I think it kind of comes up as you just said, with the idea that once these things go out, there's a general kind of energy in the states to pass them. One of the interesting things that has recently I've been toying with the idea of is if we got to a moment again where we could have a constitutional amendment, the power and the partisanship of the holdout state, and if there was some type of group of holdout states that Ben just kind of reminded me of it, of the idea of holding a gun to Mississippi's head. But what if Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and what if a third of them decided to kind of to forestall this and almost this kind of not filibuster, just a factional way, to kind of and I is that something that's ever contemplated in this?
Yes, that's how it was. There were all. as you might imagine, the amendments from the civil rights era, it was the South that were the ones that were not ratifying. If you look at a lot of the periods, it's regional things. And one scholar, his name is now blanking on me, but I will remember. He thought about the sort of amendments in like regional sort of pushes, right?
Yes.
And so
I know
like
what you're talking about. Is this some? Okay, sorry.
I'll remember. But he kind of thought about, like, for example, the Progressive Era amendments were like Western amendments, right? Because that's where you had like a lot of the populism and those sorts of things. And the first bunch of amendments were Southern amendments, right? Because it was really the anti-federalists and specifically pushes of Virginia to try to like get the Bill of Rights in, for example. And the sort of Reconstruction ones were obviously the Northern amendments, right? Because it was the North fighting the war that won, right? And so kind of thought about it like that. But you, in terms of getting, having the opposition at the ratification stage, yeah, like it happens like that. And the South, I would say, is sort of like the biggest example, the best example of how that happens in regional ways. But I mean, the point is, though, if you get enough energy and support in the first instance to get a super majority in Congress, like, whatever pushed those members of Congress to do that, whatever sort of energy is in the states to kind of get that, it's probably on your side, or not like completely against your side at that point, right? Because you have the same electorate electing these people. Now, gerrymandering is going to play into some of these things too, but like gerrymandering plays out both in the state and federal level. But once you have enough sort of energy in Congress, you probably had enough energy in the states in the first place to send those members to Congress. And at that point in time, like, it's so novel and sort of unexpected to amend the Constitution that the people in the states, once you get something in front of them, they're like, everybody's chatting about it. Like, are we going to do this? Are we not? Like, there's a real deliberation going on and probably a push to get those things through.
Yeah. So we should pivot to. Wait, go ahead, Ben.
Before we go to audience questions,
I was gonna wanted to go to prohibition, but you can go to. But you can ask
before we
first.
go to prohibitions,
yeah.
I wanna ask what the program is that you're advocating as a prospective matter. So let's take the history as you state it as a given, and say, arguably some of the conditions you describe are present today, but really what's present today is a sharp degree of political polarization of a sort that makes any action, let alone, sending to the states and 3/4 ratifying, very difficult to imagine. So what, other than the need for a civil war, or for the admission of a shitload of new states so that you change the dynamic here, which is a great argument for imperialism, is what follows from everything you're arguing about the way we should think of our own relationship with the amendability of the Constitution?
Yeah, so and political polarization is actually one of those things you also see in the periods right before amendments. So the thought is, and the hope is, that when that gives way, you get this new governing majority or this coalition that now has this mandate to do big things, including things that will sort of alleviate the problems that caused the polarization in the first instance. So every period had this period of intense polarization, obviously, and then there became this big mandate. So the first mandate, obviously, was the Federalists, right? And they had complete control. And despite their sort of worst angels telling them not to propose the Bill of Rights, they did it anyway. You had the radical Republicans. Again, that's a different sort of situation, but like polarization to the max, obviously, if you're having a civil war. Same thing that happens with the realignment in the sort of progressive era. You have these sort of back and forth elections for a while, two misfires from the Electoral College in a 12-year period. That should sound familiar to us today. And sort of in like swings in control of Congress. And then you finally get this opening. And then obviously there is the polarization that existed during the civil rights era. And again, I'm pointing to the South, which is like very much on doing its own thing. And so hopefully that polarization breaks and you get this opportunity to do big things. And so I guess the second part of your question is like prescriptive. We specifically did not advocate specific amendments, a plan, right? I'm happy to talk about some of the things I think about, some of the things we thought about together. Right, and part of it is that really the core of this is to show what happened in history and how that can create a sort of game plan, or show you like the frustration that people felt before people amended the Constitution in these other periods. They were whining about the same things we were whining about. This is not possible. It is unwise. Do not tamper with the framers' handiwork. All those sorts of things we hear today, those exact things were said right before it became possible and it became wise, and we decided to tamper with the framers' handiwork. And so, and we did so in a way, again, that just made our Constitution more democratic, more protective of rights. Operationally, the government works better and more inclusive of everyone, and that's important. And so I can talk about a few things. I put the Electoral College up there. I really do think that, like if we can get out of this sort of polarized framework, and that sort of like is one of the things we're assuming, again, you have the break in that. That has always been a popular idea. It's just like when you had the obstruction to it. So in the 1960s and 70s, when it was put up, 80% of Americans wanted to get rid of the Electoral College, and it was the Senate that stopped it. It got the votes in the House, the supermajority in the House. So I put that up there. I'd say we're missing an affirmative right to vote. And a lot of what we have is this sort of, we talked about democracy and expanding that. What we have is a robust anti-discrimination framework in our Constitution about the right to vote, but nothing proactive and actually putting a positive right to vote. And I think, if we look at the states, 49 of the state constitutions have some positive right to vote, and they've been able to do wonderful things with them. Some of them have used their provisions about free and fair elections and the right to vote to actually to rule gerrymanders unconstitutional, right? Some of them have used it to say this voting ID law is too onerous. And so maybe, taking something from the states, as I said, is something that we've done with amendments, is the idea in that regard. I think the ERA, it's way overdue to get the ERA. But then there's other things. Everybody's talking about like the overreach of a Supreme Court or like their lifetime tenure. People have talked about rotating membership of the Supreme Court. There's a whole commission about this right now, right? And
Jack Volkin's been on to talk about it. Like, I mean, this is like, we all think that it's not going to do anything. I was very optimistic about Jack Goldsmith is on. There's like a whole bunch of our favorite people.
I don't think there. But let me say something about commissions. Yeah. Commissions have also been in the sort of backdrop of amendments, especially in the civil rights era. Kennedy had so many commissions, ones that talked about the decline of democracy, and that led to sort of ideas for the 18-year-old vote. There was the Commission on Women, I think it was called American Women, that was sort of headed by Eleanor Roosevelt at the time, that was the precursor to all the changes in the Civil Rights Act that added sex to the Civil Rights Act, and also led to the ERA.
With lesbian rights, but that's another story too. But
Sure. But like there were these commissions, and while they themselves can sometimes seem like, ways for presidents to punt, some of the nuggets in those things actually have become amendments. And that's important. So I think, while presidents don't have any formal role in amending the Constitution, that is specifically left to the legislators, both the legislators in Congress and legislators in the states, presidents have had a role in sort of prompting some things, including either just going out and urging them or setting commissions that might set the stage and sort of examine some of these issues.
That is like, I think that's a super valuable, point. Really? Oh, so oh my God, it's 5:43.
Yeah, but we gotta go to prohibition now.
We have to go to So I have not watched the Ken Burns documentary, but have had it summarized to me. Is it terrible? Do you hate it?
I haven't seen it yet.
Okay. Maybe we should watch it together. That'd be fun. But anyway,
maybe we can watch it in my orange room before I'm going in labor. All that stuff.
better than an epidural, that orange room. But there's
this conversation is taking a weird ass turn, guys. Got this sibling rivalry thing going.
I know.
This is reminding me that we need to bring back Pugilism Week.
Oh yeah. I know, but we're not being pugilistic. I guess we're
there's nothing pugilistic about this at all.
Oh no! Yes.
Oh, really? No, it's not. I'm just
no. It's kind and gentle.
It is. Well, you should meet my brother. Anyways, they were like, but wow. But I will say but prohibition. I was actually thinking about this the other day. I was kind of just like laughing to myself. Maybe I had some like weird dream about the fact that there had been 100 years. Actually, I think it was because of the 100-year anniversary of women getting the right to vote. But the idea that we had two constitutions, both to ban and then repeal the ban. We'd gotten enough people together in like a pretty decent stretch of time, like 9 years apart, that the amendments come, and like, so not like that there had been some type of coalition or a switch in coalition that had come together in that period of time, that either it had kept together and then changed its mind, or the coalition had changed. And that like the cultural moment had changed. And I just think that there's like, putting aside all of the social context that Ken Burns kind of tells of like, it was all about the sudden rise of grain alcohol and hard alcohol instead of beer and wine. Men are getting plastered and beating their wives. And there was like this public health concern, which I totally, in part buy. But like, I also kind of think that we've never really cared that much about domestic violence. So this kind of strikes me as slightly weird that we would all of a sudden coalesce around like just that to be the reason that we decide to like ban something that lets us all have a lot of fun. And so like, I really do wonder like what was going on. And I find it to be fascinating as a cluster, the things that happened in this moment. And as we have you and I have talked about before, the closeness of the abolitionist movement, the Black rights movements, the women's rights movements, the prohibition movements, this like all of them kind of like Venn diagramming together in various ways at the same time, and then like riding each other's coattails into these amendments. So like, could we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's so much there, and like it's funny that prohibition has so much to unpack, and I think you just like threw a lot of different nuggets out there that hopefully we can like unpack a couple of them. So one thing is, there's such an overlap between these movements. So abolition, we think about as the great movement, right, of the 19th century. That's the big movement. But like going on at the same time were those women's movements and the temperance movement, and really those people, they were coincide. They cut their teeth in the abolitionist movement, and they took those skills and pushed for the amendments of their sort of specific focus that were like decades and decades in the making. So prohibition and the women's rights movement the women's suffrage movement were long in the making when they came. Let me actually talk about the tie between those two. So interestingly enough, they were really closely related because you talk about some of the reasons. Domestic violence, right? Like that's a big reason, at least told. Who knows, right? But
yeah, I mean, like it's told. I just think I guess there's like a part.
Yeah, there's also like
why would men take
and racism that were like weird things going on. Lots of dynamics.
It's a big part, though, of the reason that the women's movement, the early suffrage movement, was so compelled by temperance, and those two issues were very closely linked because they were thinking about the welfare of women.
And it's a big reason why both were blocked. So it's not a surprise that once you get the prohibition movement, it's okay to let women vote because women were the ones pushing the prohibition movement. So now that that's not a problem or you can't control for that, then you can now let them vote because like, what's the difference, right? And you get that within years of each other, they are actually ratified. So it's that it's interlocking in that way. You talked about that being the only amendment to be repealed, and that happened about a little bit more than a decade after that. And that was a different sort of energy. So there's a few things going on there. One is, so I just to sort of go back to the sort of idea that this was part like of these movements that were sort of intersecting. Like, you know, there's this guy, Wayne Wheeler, who was like heading up the lobbying group around prohibition. That kind of was, he was like sort of like your precursor to the NRA, right? Like it was a very sophisticated, well-run operation to get prohibition, like, you know, sort of your, like, think about like your scorecards for members, like they were a real pressure group, right? And they did all the tactics that people built on the abolitionist movement, but sort of modernized it. But then you get the repeal. And one thing to note is you have this period, like a 20-year period, I want to say, where you don't get a redistricting. So, and this was because rural parts of the country, the rural states in the West and the South, they had power. And they knew that the growth of immigration and the movement to the city, those actually, that would have shifted the power to different regions, to the Midwest and the North again. And so that non-redistricting gave temperance supporters in those states where it had its greatest support power that they should not have had, because they were, so they got it kind of over the line with sort of like undue power. And not surprisingly, once you finally get that redistricting in 1929 and 1930, then you actually get the repeal, because where the people are, one, they're already tired of this like bad idea of putting social policy into the Constitution, and they want to like pop their champagne bottles. But two, now they actually have the power that's due to them because they've been redistricted and apportioned properly. And so, yeah, you get that sort of that push back, and you get the amendment. And the last final, and the other thing about prohibition, the repeal, actually, that's interesting. That's the only way. I did not know
that the redistricting was a core part of the repeal. I did not know.
Huge.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's so interesting.
Constitutional hardball is weaved through the entire story. Like, and that's one of the examples. Like, but the other thing about prohibition that's really interesting is it is the only amendment where it was ratified by state conventions as opposed to state legislators. So Article 5 gives the ability, Congress gets to choose whether it's going to be state legislators or these special ratifying conventions in the states to ratify. And so this was a way, one, it showed you that the people really wanted this, but two, it kind of took the pressure off of the temperance supporters that still existed. They weren't the ones that had to do the dirty work in the end. And so you get that one example of popular conventions actually ratifying that. People really wanted to drink.
Yeah, I mean, that's nothing we can relate to on this show.
No. Cucumber water.
Yeah, I know, you weirdo.
My cognac glass is empty already.
Oh my God. Hello, Shailesh. So nice to see you. Excellent question as usual. Go ahead and ask it.
Thanks. So I want to explore the role of thought leaders in all of this. So can we make constitutional amendments or any big strides forward without having exceptional thought leaders leading the charge? So after the last 4 years, or 5, I should say at this point, it feels really unfair that mediocre people are capable of messing things up, but improving things requires an MLK or a Gandhi or a civil war. And what does that say about us as people? Like, you know, are we able to make continuous improvements, or does it take sort of catastrophic events or big sort of changes to improve things?
Yeah, so one thing I want to say is we evolve. Constitutional amendments are not the only way we change the Constitution. And so we talk about these amendments because they are ingrained. There's an importance to enshrining new texts in the Constitution that gives like judges an ability to find a command or something to base their commands off of. It often sort of ratifies something that was going on before the amendment itself, right? So they're important. They change the actual organic law, the text of our Constitution. But we are also changing through politics and through the Supreme Court and other ways. Culturally, we're changing. And often what we're doing is like right in the aftermath of amendments, what we're trying to do is to like situate ourselves and get used to the big changes that have happened, the amendments themselves, but all the push that led up to that period. And then during that period, we're really trying to figure out what these new amendments mean, right? Like we're technically in this period of non-amending activity, at least formally, but we're really doing stuff. We're evolving, we're changing, we're making, we're either making steps back or a step forward, right? Overall, the progress is, the arc is sort of long and forward, but like, you know, we have like, following the amendments, we've also had revisionist sort of behavior too, right? Like we had the sort of lost cause and Jim Crow after Reconstruction. We've had, like, again, a very conservative pushback to the civil rights movement in the 70s. And so we are changing constitutionally in both senses during those periods. But the sort of amendments are like the sort of beacon of those change. They either sort of shore up everything that was happening, or they make a big change that needed to happen in that period. So hopefully that's not the only way we think about change. We shouldn't, but it is a very important way that we haven't thought about enough recently. And that was one of the prompts of the book. We should be thinking about amending the Constitution.
So I kind of want to close with that question. So I want to ask the question: is there a natural reason why amendments have lost our attention as a mechanism of change? Is there something that is structurally, or the formalism of the amendments is not as compelling to us as periodic measures as we want, like, the courts to reflect in kind of slower, like more or that we don't want the courts to reflect, depending on the day, right? Like in kind of what they're doing and how they're interpreting various aspects of the law. And one of the things that I'm kind of wondering as I'm listening to you is, like, is there a way that, like, you're arguing for almost an originalism, but changing what the original structure is? So change the mast that you tie yourself to, right? Don't like change the binds. Don't change, like, you know, like every, you know, but like change like what it is that you're structuring yourself to. And that is the more legitimate means of change, rather than all of these things around the edges. And I'm just wondering, like, what you kind of.
I've never been called an originalist, but thank you, Kate, for that.
I just had to one last time. Oh, sorry, Ben is like, Ben, you're muted. Go ahead.
I mean, you'd never. Have you ever been called pregnant before?
Yeah, well, that's true. That is, you are not wrong on that, Ben.
Yeah. Well, you should like see Will. He's like the most, whatever. But like
pregnant
like,
person, you know.
Yeah, that's basically what I was gonna say. But no, but like there is. I will say that. Yeah, I'm just kind of. No, I know you've never been called an originalist, but I do actually wonder.
Yeah,
like,
no.
If there is like an element of like, if the reform you're calling for is amending the Constitution rather than like strategic litigation or like other types of change, like it's like an everything and the kitchen sink kind of argument, or maybe it's like a okay. Then
no, and I really appreciate that. I think that we have to engage in ways that are going to change the Constitution across the board. I think strategic litigation is important, and I think if there's anything that one, the ACLU has taught us, but then those organizations that sort of on the conservative side that have modeled themselves off the rise of the ACLU have taught us is like the Supreme Court is a real strategy for constitutional change. And so you can't just completely let that down. But for some things, it's just not an avenue if they're not going to change their mind. So Citizens United is not going to be reversed anytime soon. So if you want to change that sort of thought, you need to amend the Constitution, because that's the only way you got it. There is, I think, importance.
Wait, Ben,
I think Ben, Ben is.
Oh, sorry. But the flip side of that is that, you know, if you take starting with the Nixon administration, a very explicit goal was to abort no pun intended, to abort constitutional change that was ongoing through
Yeah.
additions to the court. And then particularly starting in the Reagan administration, that idea is extended to a kind of prospective constitutional vision. That's largely been a pretty effective way to change, at least in a defensive fashion, to change constitutional substance as well.
Yeah, and I think the last 50 years have really, like, this is the first period like where conservatives are really driving the whole discussion about the Constitution. This goes back to Kate's point, which is that people have given up on amendments, but also given up on other things. They find it to be just completely not worth the effort. Or if we're going to push for constitutional change, let's push for other measures first and see where that gets us. Well, I think that got us 50 years of nothing, right? And that's what it's proving. But I think people get exasperated, but people also just don't know the history, right? Because this happens, the dry spells are generations long. In history, people forget the history short. Lo and behold, people are really clamoring. Some people are clamoring for an insurrectionist to be elected president, like a year and a half after the or less than a year and a half after the insurrection, right? So people's memories of history are short. And the idea of this book is to like jog that memory, that this is like we faced in circumstances like this. After a time, people got fed up and saw that the Constitution wasn't doing the work that it needed to govern effectively. It was not protecting our rights. It was not making we the people, the actual people who are consenting to what's being governed, but instead being governed by sort of, the interest or certain elites or what have you that are not reflecting us. And so the idea here is really to show that history, to say that we are in a comparable period right now. And we are seeing some of those catalysts that I mentioned, some that I didn't mention. I'll save some for the book for y'all to read. But we're seeing some of these conditions right now. Yeah. And we should take that seriously, right? Because all of the other stuff is not going to work, or it only works for so long. It's one way of amending the Constitution through like the courts and political movements, as Bruce Ackerman said, sort of the New Deal revolution. But the way we do in the textual basis is important, because you're always going to have conservatives say, well, that's not in the Constitution. Well, a nice thing to say is, yes, it is, right? And then sort of build off of it where you do, as we do in this common law way that we do with doctrine. So yeah, that's originalist me, but like that's originalist me melding with the sort of living constitutionalist me and the sort of activist me and the me that want to see a more progressive, more perfect union. And I think constitutional amendments need to be a part of that bucket of things that we're sort of using.
Will Codrington for president.
No.
We are going to...
There's so much
there. I just want to point out that in the current poll about what constitutional amendments you'd be most likely to favor, both universal time and mandatory dog shirts are beating banning orange wallpaper. Vote for universal time and mandatory dog shirts. Yes, I'm thrilled.
I'll take a dog shirt.
We'll send you a dog shirt.
Yeah, if you'll wear a dog shirt on the show, we'll send you one.
Yeah. You don't even have to wear it on the show. You can just tweet it. But we have to wrap up. I have to get going. But thank you so much for coming on. This was amazing. Let's come back and do an ERA day. Maybe we can get Reva Siegel to come on. That would be fun.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We will be back tomorrow. Genevieve and I will be doing cheese night. Kate is taking the night off. Scott has vanished in a puff of smoke. And
he's actually teaching law school.
He's actually teaching law school or doing debating with Michael Ellis or something.
Yeah.
Who knows? But we will be back 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, Kate, I just want to tell you, we can't have fun anymore, but we can paint our walls orange to drive you to distraction.
Paint it on orange.
Oh my God.